Frankie Gonzales was 42 years old and worked as a commercial risk auditor in Columbus, Ohio. Most people at the table thought he looked exactly like the kind of man life forgets. Quiet, cheap watch. Gray Toyota Camry parked beside luxury SUVs outside Hawthorne and Birch Steakhouse. Vanessa liked to joke that Frankie still folded grocery receipts like they were legal evidence. Everyone laughed when she said it. What they didn't know was Frankie had spent 6 months documenting every hidden account, forged signature, and missing dollar connected to his wife. Then Vanessa lifted her wine glass and smiled. Marrying Frankie was the biggest regret of my life. Beside him, investor Elliot Whitmore slowly lowered his fork. Before we continue, drop your country and local time in the comments. I always like seeing where people are watching from. And if you enjoy slow burn stories about betrayal, quiet revenge, and people being underestimated, subscribe to the channel. Tomorrow's story gets even colder. The private dining room at Hawthorne and Birch smelled like grilled ribeye oak whiskey barrels and expensive cologne. Low jazz rolled softly through hidden ceiling speakers, while downtown Columbus traffic glowed behind the tall glass windows. The restaurant sat on North High Street, 6 floors above the city, where people with money came to look relaxed while discussing numbers large enough to change lives. Vanessa Gonzales loved places like this. Frankie could tell by the way she sat. Straight posture, chin lifted slightly, one hand resting beside her wine glass so the diamond bracelet stayed visible under the candlelight. She had worn the white blazer he bought her 3 years earlier in Chicago, back when she still thanked him for things. Now she wore it like evidence that she had outgrown him. Rachel Monroe leaned back in her chair first. "I still can't believe Frankie actually agreed to come tonight," she said, smirking over her martini glass. "No offense." Derek Holloway laughed immediately because Derek always laughed first. It was safer that way. Frankie gave a small shrug. "No offense taken." That only made Rachel grin wider. The waiter arrived carrying a 48-ounce tomahawk steak for the center of the table. Vanessa immediately pulled out her phone. "Wait," she said. "Nobody touch it yet." She angled the camera carefully while Elliot Whitmore watched in silence from beside Frankie. Flash. Another angle. Another. Only after posting the photo did Vanessa finally lean back. "Okay, now we can eat." Derek chuckled. "Your clients are going to think you live here." Vanessa smiled proudly. "That's the point." Frankie unfolded his napkin carefully across his lap, while the others talked about luxury condos, investor dinners, and a new rooftop project opening near the Scioto Mile. He barely spoke. Most people interpreted silence as insecurity. Frankie knew that. He also knew silence made people careless. Vanessa was halfway through her second glass of Cabernet before she finally turned toward Elliot Whitmore. So she said smoothly, "What convinced you to finally meet with Vale and Stone?" Elliot rested both hands around his whiskey tumbler before answering. "Your pitch deck was strong," he said calmly. "Good growth projections." Vanessa smiled immediately. "I told you," she said to the table. "We're scaling faster than people expected." Frankie noticed the wording. "We're scaling. Not we scaled. Present tense, pretending to be past tense. Tiny detail. Important detail." Elliot nodded once. "I'm careful with early-stage investments," he said, "especially branding firms." Vanessa leaned forward slightly. "And that's exactly why we're different." Frankie watched her enter performance mode. The voice changed first, slower, more polished. Then the gestures. Controlled hand movements, direct eye contact. Small pauses after important words. She had practiced this version of herself for months, maybe years. "We already have regional hospitality accounts lined up," Vanessa continued. 3 more contracts close next quarter." Frankie sipped iced tea quietly. He knew 2 of those contracts did not exist. One company had already declined her proposal. Another had threatened legal action over unpaid creative work. But nobody at the table knew that. Rachel crossed one leg over the other. "I'm honestly just happy Vanessa finally built something worthy of her," she said. Derek laughed again. "Come on, Frankie. You know she was always too ambitious for suburban life." Vanessa smirked. Frankie kept his expression neutral. Outside the window, headlights drifted slowly through downtown traffic like white rivers beneath the rain. Frankie likes simple things, Vanessa added. Routine, safety, predictability. Her tone stayed playful. That made it worse. Elliot remained silent. Frankie noticed that too. Most wealthy men in rooms like this liked hearing themselves talk. Elliot didn't. He listened. That made him dangerous. The waiter returned with fresh drinks. Vanessa barely waited until he left before speaking again. "You know what Frankie asked me last month?" she said. Rachel leaned forward immediately. "What?" Vanessa laughed. "He asked if I really needed to fly business class to Miami." Rachel burst out laughing so hard she covered her mouth. "Oh my God." Derek shook his head. "Man, you gotta loosen up." Frankie looked down briefly at the condensation sliding along his glass. He remembered the Miami receipts, the spa charges, the resort dinners for two, the hotel room booked under Bellcrest Holdings, LLC. Vanessa had claimed the trip was for networking. Frankie already knew it wasn't. Still, he said nothing. Vanessa pointed toward him dramatically. "See, that face right there? That's exactly what living with an auditor is like." More laughter. Elliot finally spoke. "What kind of auditing?" The room quieted slightly. Frankie looked toward him. "Commercial risk assessment," he answered. Vanessa jumped in before he could continue. "It's basically corporate paperwork," she said dismissively. Frankie noticed Elliot's eyes remain on him instead of her. "How long have you done that?" Elliot asked. "About 14 years. "Same company?" Frankie folded the edge of his napkin once between his fingers. "I mostly work contract litigation now." Vanessa rolled her eyes playfully. "Translation insurance companies hire him to stare at spreadsheets until midnight." Rachel laughed again. Frankie noticed Elliot did not. The investor studied him carefully now. Not the way people studied boring men, the way experienced businessmen studied missing information. Vanessa didn't see it. She kept talking. "That's why tonight is important," she said proudly. "I'm finally entering rooms Frankie never understood." There it was again. Not ambition. Contempt. Frankie had started noticing the difference around 2 years ago. Contempt had a rhythm to it. A person repeated the same humiliation often enough that eventually it stopped sounding emotional and started sounding rehearsed. Derek cut into the steak. "So when Whitmore Strategic officially invests, he asked Elliot what happens next." Vanessa answered before Elliot could. "Expansion," she said instantly. "Chicago office first, then Nashville." Elliot glanced toward her. "You already have staffing plans." "Of course." "How many retained clients currently?" Vanessa hesitated. Less than a second. But Frankie saw it. 7 active, she answered. Another lie. Frankie looked toward the whiskey shelves across the room. The reflection in the glass showed Elliot watching Vanessa carefully now. Not admiring, calculating. Rachel raised her glass suddenly. "To Vanessa," she declared. "Proof that some people are meant for bigger things." Everyone lifted their drinks, even Frankie. Vanessa smiled beautifully into the candlelight. Then she looked directly at her husband. "You know," she said softly, "marrying Frankie was probably the biggest regret of my life." The laughter came slower this time, more cautious, because even drunk people recognized something sharp when they heard it. Frankie turned calmly toward Elliot Whitmore, and for the first time all night, the investor no longer looked entertained. He looked concerned. Then Frankie recognized the company name printed on the leather folder resting beside Elliot's chair. Whitmore Strategic Ventures. The same name attached to the pending investment documents sitting inside Frankie's locked garage toolbox at home. The same documents connected to forged revenue projections. And suddenly, underneath the jazz music and crystal glasses and candlelight, Frankie understood something cold and important. Elliot Whitmore had absolutely no idea who Vanessa really was. 6 months earlier, Frankie Gonzales noticed the missing money on a Thursday night at 11:14 p.m. The house was quiet except for the dishwasher humming softly in the kitchen on Briarwood Lane. Rain tapped against the back patio doors while a Cleveland Browns game replay flickered silently across the television. Vanessa had already gone upstairs. Frankie sat alone at the dining room table with his reading glasses low on his nose and his laptop open beside a stack of utility bills. That was normal. Frankie handled the bills because Frankie handled everything that required consistency. Mortgage payments, insurance renewals, property taxes, retirement contributions. Vanessa liked calling it his little systems. Tonight, one of those systems stopped making sense. Frankie stared at the Wells Fargo account summary again, then once more. Then he opened the transaction history. $18,400 transferred out 3 days earlier. No memo, no notification, no discussion. He checked the linked accounts carefully. Nothing. A slow heaviness settled into his chest. Not panic. Frankie almost never panicked. Experience had taught him something years ago during commercial litigation work. Panic makes people sloppy. So he kept looking. He checked timestamps first, then routing numbers, then external transfer authorization logs. The transfer had been approved using Vanessa's mobile banking credentials. Frankie leaned back quietly in his chair. Upstairs, he could hear Vanessa walking across the bedroom floor. Steady footsteps. Relaxed. Not the footsteps of someone worried about $18,000 disappearing. The next morning, Frankie asked her calmly while she made coffee. "Did we move money out of savings this week?" Vanessa barely looked up from her phone. "Business expenses. What kind branding stuff?" She said it casually, too casually. Frankie watched steam rise from her coffee mug. "What kind of branding stuff costs 18 grand? Vanessa sighed dramatically. "This is exactly why I don't talk to you about business." Frankie stayed quiet. She continued scrolling Instagram while speaking. "You wouldn't understand startup scaling." There it was again. That word, scaling. She had started using business language the same way some people wore designer labels. Not naturally, deliberately. Frankie nodded once. Okay. That answer seemed to annoy her more than an argument would have. "You know," she said, finally looking at him, "not every expense needs your approval." Frankie noticed she said your approval instead of our discussion. Another detail. He left for work 20 minutes later. The drive downtown took 32 minutes in morning traffic. Frankie spent most of it listening to AM financial radio while his mind quietly replayed the conversation. Not emotionally, structurally. That was how his brain worked. Most people heard tone first. Frankie heard inconsistencies. By noon, he had already logged into their shared financial portal from his office downtown. He exported 6 months of transaction histories into spreadsheets. Not because he thought Vanessa was committing fraud. Not yet. But because numbers usually told the truth before people did. The first thing he noticed was frequency. Small, unexplained charges had started appearing 8 months earlier. $740, $1,120, $2,900, always categorized as business expenses. Always followed by Vanessa becoming defensive whenever he asked. The second thing he noticed was timing. Most charges appeared late at night or during weekends. That mattered. Legitimate business operations usually moved during predictable banking windows. These didn't. The third thing bothered him most. Several payments routed through a company Frankie had never heard of before. Bellcrest Holdings, LLC. He wrote the name down carefully inside a small black notebook he kept beside his keyboard. 3 days later, another problem surfaced. A late mortgage notice arrived from Fifth Third Bank. Frankie opened the envelope twice because he genuinely thought it had been sent by mistake. He never missed payments. Ever. He checked the account immediately. The mortgage auto payment had failed due to insufficient transfer balance. That stopped him cold. Not emotionally, mathematically. Their household income should not have been anywhere near insufficient. Vanessa was in the shower when he walked upstairs holding the notice. He placed it quietly on the bathroom counter. She stepped out 10 minutes later, wrapped in a white towel. "What's this?" The mortgage payment bounced. Vanessa rolled her eyes immediately. "Oh my God, Frankie. What happened?" "It's temporary. What is cash flow?" Frankie stared at her. She kept drying her hair while talking. "That's normal when you're growing a business. You said the business was profitable. It is profitable. Then why are we missing mortgage payments?" Vanessa stopped brushing her hair. For a second, irritation flashed across her face. Then it disappeared behind a tired smile. "You really don't get entrepreneurship." There it was again. Not explanation, superiority. Frankie folded the notice carefully in half. Okay. That night he began documenting everything, not secretly, methodically. Every bank statement downloaded into encrypted folders, every invoice saved, every credit card report archived. He created spreadsheets tracking outgoing transfers, payment recipients, account numbers, and dates. Years of commercial auditing had trained him to build timelines. Fraud rarely began with dramatic theft. It began with patterns people ignored because the individual pieces looked small. By the second week, Frankie stopped sleeping well. Not because he felt betrayed, because the numbers were accelerating. Their home equity line had increased by nearly $60,000 in 4 months. 2 retirement withdrawals had occurred without discussion. 3 business credit cards existed under Vanessa's company. Frankie had known about only one. Still, he never confronted her emotionally. No yelling, no accusations, no threats. That confused Vanessa more than anger would have. One evening, she walked into the garage while Frankie sat organizing printed statements inside labeled folders. "You seriously made binders?" she asked, laughing. Frankie looked up calmly. "I like records." She smirked. "God, you really are 60 years old inside." Then she kissed the top of his head casually and walked back inside. Frankie listened to the kitchen door close behind her. He stared at the folder in front of him. Bellcrest Holdings, LLC. That name kept appearing everywhere. Wire transfers, consulting fees, travel reimbursements. Finally, late one Sunday night, Frankie searched the Ohio Secretary of State business database from his laptop. The LLC registration appeared instantly. Registered owner Vanessa Marie Calderon, her maiden name. Frankie sat completely still. Rain tapped softly against the garage windows while the glow from his laptop reflected off stacked storage bins nearby. The filing address was not their home. It was a UPS mailbox location near Dublin Road. He checked the registration date. 14 months earlier. More than a year. Vanessa had created a separate company without telling him. Frankie leaned back slowly in the folding chair. For the first time since this started, something sharp moved beneath his calm. Not heartbreak, not rage, recognition. Because hidden LLCs were rarely created for convenience. They were created for separation, protection, concealment. He opened another spreadsheet, then another. He worked until 2:11 in the morning reconstructing transfer paths between accounts. Patterns emerged quickly now. Money moving from personal savings into Bellcrest Holdings, then disappearing into Vale and Stone Creative, then reappearing as inflated revenue entries, artificial growth, artificial liquidity, artificial success. Frankie removed his glasses slowly. The dishwasher inside the house had already stopped hours earlier. Everything was silent. Upstairs, Vanessa slept peacefully. And for the first time in 14 years of marriage, Frankie realized he was no longer trying to understand his wife. He was investigating her. Then his eyes stopped on one final transaction buried deep inside the records. A scheduled meeting deposit connected to Whitmore Strategic Ventures. $750,000 pending investor review. Frankie stared at the screen. Very slowly, he closed the laptop. Because suddenly, this was no longer about hidden spending inside a marriage. Someone else was about to walk blindly into the same trap. Vanessa launched Vale and Stone Creative on a rainy Tuesday in September. By Friday afternoon, she had already posted 11 professional photos on LinkedIn. In every image, she looked like a woman who had conquered something difficult. Sharp white office walls, minimalist furniture, floor-to-ceiling windows overlooking downtown Columbus. Designer coffee cups placed carefully beside open MacBooks. The illusion was expensive. Frankie knew exactly how expensive because he had paid for most of it without realizing. The office itself sat inside the refurbished Madison building near East Gay Street. Exposed brick, black steel frames, shared conference rooms with frosted glass logos. The kind of place young entrepreneurs rented when they wanted investors to believe momentum already existed. Vanessa gave tours like she owned the entire floor. Brand identity is psychological architecture, she told people during networking events. Frankie heard her say that phrase 4 different times, always with the exact same pause afterward. Rehearsed. Everything about Vale and Stone felt rehearsed. 2 weeks after launch, Vanessa hosted a rooftop mixer with catered sushi custom cocktails and a local photographer documenting the night for social media. Frankie attended because she asked him to. Correction, because she instructed him to. "Please don't wear that brown jacket," she said while getting ready upstairs. "You look like somebody's substitute math teacher." Frankie looked down at the jacket silently. It was the same jacket she once bought him for Christmas. He hung it back inside the closet without arguing. At the rooftop event, Vanessa moved through groups effortlessly, touching elbows, laughing at the right volume, remembering names instantly. Frankie stood near the edge of the rooftop beside industrial heating lamps and watched the city lights reflect across wet streets below. A catering server offered him champagne. Iced tea, Frankie asked instead. The server looked confused for half a second before nodding. Frankie noticed details other people ignored. The rented furniture tags hidden underneath lounge chairs. The fake client logos printed onto display boards. The photographer retaking crowd shots to make the event appear larger online. None of it technically meant fraud, but it meant image mattered more than reality. That always led somewhere dangerous eventually. Near the center bar, Vanessa laughed loudly beside Rachel Monroe and several local startup founders. Frankie still balances checkbooks manually, Vanessa joked. The group laughed. He literally prints spreadsheets. More laughter. Frankie sipped iced tea quietly beside the railing. He wasn't embarrassed anymore. That feeling had started fading months ago. Now he mostly observed, like a man standing outside his own marriage, watching weather damage spread across a building. 3 days later, Frankie received another alert from Fifth Third Bank. Home equity line increase approved. He stared at the number. $82,000. His jaw tightened slightly. They had opened the line years earlier for emergency repairs. Vanessa had almost maxed it out. That night he waited until she came home from the office. You increased the HELOC again. Vanessa dropped her handbag onto the kitchen island. Can we not do this tonight? It's $82,000. It's leverage. It's debt. Vanessa sighed heavily, like he was exhausting her on purpose. You know what your problem is? Frankie stayed silent. You think like somebody who'll always stay middle class. There it was again. Not discussion. Contempt wrapped inside ambition. Vanessa walked toward the wine fridge. Successful businesses require risk. Frankie looked toward the kitchen window over the sink. Outside their quiet neighborhood sat under orange streetlights and early autumn rain. Normal houses, normal families, normal debt. But nothing about their finances was normal anymore. Where exactly is the money going? He asked calmly. Vanessa uncorked wine without looking at him. Growth. Frankie nodded slowly. Okay. That answer irritated her immediately. She turned around. Why do you always say okay like that? Like what? Like you're secretly judging me. Frankie watched her carefully. Years earlier, Vanessa used to fight emotionally. Now she fought defensively. Different thing entirely. I'm asking questions, he said. You're monitoring me. No. Yes, you are. She poured wine aggressively into the glass. You act like I'm stealing from you. Frankie said nothing. That silence lasted too long. Vanessa looked away first. 2 nights later, Frankie sat alone inside the garage reviewing credit statements when another inconsistency surfaced. A $14,200 transfer categorized as vendor payment. Recipient Bellcrest Holdings, LLC. Again. Frankie traced the transfer chain carefully. Bellcrest received funds from personal accounts, then transferred money directly into Vail and Stone payroll records. Artificial revenue stabilization. He stared at the numbers for several minutes. Then he opened another folder. Inside sat printed vendor invoices Vanessa had left accidentally inside the home office printer tray. At first glance, they looked legitimate. Graphic design outsourcing, brand consultation, digital strategy retainers. But Frankie noticed duplicated invoice formatting, identical spacing errors, repeated metadata structures, the same PDF creator timestamps, manufactured documentation. His phone buzzed suddenly beside him. Melissa Grant. Frankie recognized the name immediately from several accounting emails tied to Vail and Stone. He answered. Mr. Gonzales? Yes. This is Melissa Grant. Her voice sounded nervous. I'm sorry to call late. Frankie glanced at the garage clock. 9:42 p.m. That's all right. A pause. Then I think there may be problems with some of Vanessa's reporting. Frankie stayed completely still. What kind of problems? Another pause. I really shouldn't discuss this over the phone. Frankie leaned back slowly in the folding chair. What are you asking me exactly? Melissa lowered her voice. I'm asking if you're aware your personal retirement account appears connected to business collateral filings. The garage suddenly felt colder. Frankie looked toward the closed door leading back into the house. Inside, he could hear Vanessa laughing faintly upstairs while watching television. Send me copies, Frankie said calmly. Melissa hesitated. I could lose my license. Then don't send opinions, Frankie replied. Send records. Silence. Finally. Okay. The email arrived 19 minutes later. Frankie downloaded everything immediately. Loan applications, projected earnings reports, revenue forecasts, vendor declarations. He reviewed each document carefully. Then he stopped. One page near the back carried an authorization signature. His signature. Except he had never signed it. Frankie stared at the paper quietly. The imitation was decent. Not perfect, but decent enough to pass quickly through administrative review. He compared it against his actual signature on older mortgage files. The angle was wrong. Pressure patterns inconsistent. Forged. Frankie removed his glasses slowly. For several seconds, he simply sat there. No anger, no disbelief, only a strange exhaustion spreading through his chest. Because fraud changed things permanently. Debt could be explained. Lies could sometimes survive. But forged signatures crossed into something colder, something legal. His phone buzzed again. Another email from Melissa. One attachment. Investor review packet. Whitmore Strategic Ventures. Frankie opened the file carefully. Projected investment $750,000. Pending final due diligence meeting. Frankie studied the attached financial projections. The numbers were inflated. Expense liabilities hidden. Revenue streams fabricated. And at the bottom of the executive summary sat Vanessa's polished signature beside a scheduled dinner meeting date. Friday. Hawthorne and Birch Steakhouse. Frankie leaned back in silence. Outside rain tapped softly against the garage roof. Inside the house, Vanessa moved casually through the kitchen above him, completely unaware her entire structure had already started collapsing. Frankie closed the laptop carefully. Then he opened a fresh legal folder. For the first time since this began, he stopped organizing records like a concerned husband and started organizing them like evidence. Vanessa became crueler when she felt admired. Frankie had noticed that years ago, not immediately after they married. Back then, success made her excited, energetic, grateful even. She used to squeeze his hand under restaurant tables and whisper plans about opening a business together someday. But admiration changed shape over time. Once people started praising Vanessa publicly, she began treating kindness like weakness, especially his. At Hawthorne and Birch, the third bottle of wine arrived just after 9:30 p.m. The dinner room had grown louder since neighboring corporate groups filled the restaurant. Glassware clinked constantly beneath the low jazz music drifting through hidden speakers overhead. Outside the windows, downtown Columbus glowed wet and silver beneath recent rain. Inside, Vanessa was performing. Frankie sat quietly beside Elliot Whitmore while Rachel Monroe leaned forward laughing through another story. I'm serious, Rachel said. Frankie once brought spreadsheets on vacation. Derek nearly choked on his bourbon laughing. No, he didn't. Vanessa covered her mouth dramatically. He absolutely did. Frankie cut slowly into his steak. The truth was less ridiculous than the version they enjoyed telling. 3 years earlier, Frankie had worked remotely during a vacation in Charleston because one of his litigation cases involved fraudulent warehouse fire claims totaling $11 million. But details never mattered in rooms like this. Only the joke did. Rachel pointed toward Frankie. See, he's not even defending himself. Vanessa smirked beside her wine glass. He never does. Again, laughter spread around the table. Frankie noticed Elliot still wasn't participating. The investor sat relaxed, one arm resting against the leather booth, while quietly watching everyone else instead. Listening, calculating. Frankie respected that immediately. People who stayed quiet in loud rooms usually knew something valuable. Derek reached for another drink. I gotta admit, he said to Vanessa, it's honestly impressive how far you've come. Vanessa smiled proudly. Thank you. I mean, seriously, Derek continued. 6 figures, investor meetings, downtown office. That's big. Vanessa tilted her head slightly toward Frankie. Some people evolve, she said casually. Some people stay exactly the same. Frankie heard Rachel exhale through a laugh beside her. He kept eating. The waiter approached to refill waters. Frankie thanked him automatically. Vanessa didn't. Another small detail. Frankie had started noticing those too. The further Vanessa climbed socially, the less human she treated people beneath her. Servers, assistants, receptionists, even him, especially him. Elliot finally spoke again. How long has Vale and Stone been operating? Vanessa answered smoothly. Officially, almost a year. And profitable already. Very. Frankie glanced briefly toward her. The answer came too fast. Elliot noticed it too. What's your current burn rate? Vanessa hesitated for half a second. Tiny pause. Then, we keep overhead lean. Not an answer. Frankie watched Elliot sip whiskey slowly without responding. Vanessa immediately redirected. But honestly, the biggest challenge hasn't been business. Rachel grinned. Oh no. Vanessa laughed softly. It's trying to build a future while dragging emotional dead weight. Her eyes drifted toward Frankie. The table reacted with uncomfortable chuckles this time, instead of open laughter. Because the cruelty was no longer playful. It had edges now. Frankie rested his fork beside the plate carefully. His expression remained calm. Inside, something colder had replaced hurt weeks ago. Not forgiveness. Distance. He watched Vanessa the same way investigators watched claimants during depositions. Patiently. Without interruption. Because eventually people revealed themselves if you let them keep talking. Rachel leaned closer toward Vanessa. You should tell them about the couple's therapist. Vanessa burst into laughter immediately. Oh my God, Derek groaned. No way. Frankie already knew the story coming before Vanessa opened her mouth. He brought spreadsheets to therapy, she said. Rachel slapped the table, laughing. I knew it. Vanessa wiped tears from her eyes dramatically. He literally made bullet points about communication patterns. The table exploded again. Even Derek laughed harder now. Frankie looked down briefly at the white tablecloth beneath his hands. The therapist had actually asked both of them to document recurring conflicts objectively. Vanessa quit after the third session, but facts never survived long once mockery became entertainment. You know what his problem is? Vanessa continued. He treats emotions like insurance claims. Rachel pointed toward Frankie again. That is terrifying. Vanessa smiled toward Elliot. You understand why this marriage never really worked. Elliot did not answer immediately. That silence mattered. Frankie noticed Vanessa notice it too. For the first time all evening, a flicker of uncertainty crossed her face. So she pushed harder. People often did when they sensed control slipping. Frankie's a good guy, she said, just not exactly inspiring. Derek nodded awkwardly. Come on, man. She's joking. Frankie gave a small shrug. I know, but he also knew something nobody else at the table understood yet. Every insult Vanessa delivered tonight was happening in front of the man preparing to invest $750,000 into fabricated financials. And Elliot Whitmore was beginning to realize the woman pitching herself as disciplined and visionary couldn't stop publicly humiliating her own husband. That mattered. Professional investors evaluated behavior constantly, not just numbers. Emotional regulation, impulse control, consistency. Vanessa was failing all three. The waiter returned carrying dessert menus. Vanessa barely glanced at hers. Actually, she said, lifting her wine glass again, I think tonight deserves a toast. Rachel raised her martini immediately. Derek followed. Elliot lifted his whiskey slower. Frankie picked up his iced tea. Vanessa smiled brightly beneath the candlelight. To growth, she said. Everyone murmured agreement. To ambition. More glasses lifted. Then Vanessa looked directly at Frankie. And to finally removing dead weight from my life. Silence. Real silence this time. Not awkwardness. Impact. The kind that lands physically inside a room. Derek lowered his drink first. Rachel stared at Vanessa uncertainly. Even the waiter standing nearby paused briefly before walking away again. Frankie looked at the condensation sliding slowly down his glass. Dead weight. Interesting phrase, because 6 months ago those words might have hurt him deeply. Tonight they only confirmed something he already understood. Vanessa no longer viewed marriage as partnership. She viewed people as accessories to whatever version of success she wanted others to see. Frankie turned slightly toward Elliot. The investor's face remained calm, but his eyes had sharpened. That was enough. Vanessa noticed the shift too, so she forced another laugh. Oh, relax, everybody. You know what I mean. Nobody answered immediately. Derek finally cleared his throat. So, Elliot, when do you guys officially move forward? Vanessa grabbed the conversation instantly. Yes, she said quickly. We're very excited about next steps. Elliot rested his glass on the table carefully. What are your current liability exposures? The question hit the table like cold water. Vanessa blinked once, then smiled again. Nothing significant. Frankie watched Elliot carefully now, not because of the question, because of the timing. Experienced investors rarely shifted into due diligence mode during dinner unless concern already existed. Vanessa answered too quickly again. No debt concerns, she continued smoothly. Our expansion strategy is extremely stable. Another lie. Frankie folded his napkin once beneath the table. The home equity line alone disproved that statement, not including the hidden credit obligations, not including the forged collateral filings, not including Bellcrest Holdings. Elliot leaned back slightly. And all financial disclosures are current. Vanessa smiled. Of course. Frankie looked toward the city lights outside the window. The reflection in the glass showed Elliot studying Vanessa now the way attorneys studied witnesses during testimony. Carefully. Methodically. Vanessa still thought she controlled the room. That was the dangerous part. People performing success often became blind to changing atmospheres. And tonight the atmosphere had changed completely. Then Elliot turned toward Frankie calmly. What exactly do you audit? Vanessa opened her mouth first, but Frankie answered before she could. Commercial fraud exposure, he said quietly. The room went still again. Vanessa's smile faded slightly. Elliot held Frankie's gaze for several seconds. Then the investor nodded once, very slowly, as if a final piece had just locked into place. The silence after Frankie said the words commercial fraud exposure lasted only 3 seconds, but it changed the entire table. Vanessa recovered first. Of course she did. She laughed lightly and touched Elliot's arm as if Frankie had made some harmless joke. Oh, please, she said. He makes it sound way more dramatic than it is. Frankie noticed her fingers trembling slightly against the wine glass stem. Tiny movement. Easy to miss unless you spent years watching people lie professionally. Elliot leaned back against the leather booth. What kind of fraud exposure? He asked calmly. Frankie wiped his hands once with the napkin before answering. Mostly commercial liability investigations. Financial manipulation. False claims. Risk concealment. Rachel forced a laugh. Well, this suddenly got exciting. Nobody joined her. Vanessa smiled tightly. Frankie investigates paperwork. That's all. Frankie looked toward Elliot instead of her. Mostly patterns he corrected quietly. The investor nodded once. That answer landed differently. People who understood money understood patterns. Restaurants grew louder around them as nearby corporate groups drifted deeper into Friday night drinking. Glasses clinked. Servers moved between tables carrying steaks and bourbon flights beneath warm amber lighting. But inside the private dining room, the mood had cooled noticeably. Vanessa felt it. Frankie could tell. She reached immediately for control again. So anyway, she said brightly, Elliot and I have been discussing expansion timelines. Elliot didn't look at her. What's your current vendor structure? Vanessa blinked. What do you mean internal versus outsourced? Oh, she laughed softly. We keep operations flexible. Not an answer again. Frankie sat quietly. Vanessa continued. A lot of creative firms outsource now. Elliot rested one arm against the table. Which vendors handle your back-end operations? There it was, direct pressure. Frankie almost admired the precision. Vanessa took a sip of wine before answering. We have several names. Another pause. This one longer. Rachel shifted uncomfortably in her chair. Derek looked down at his drink. Vanessa smiled again. Honestly, I'd have to pull contracts for specifics. Frankie watched Elliot carefully. The investor no longer looked socially curious. Now he looked professionally alert. Big difference. Vanessa noticed it too late, so she pushed harder instead of slowing down. That was another thing Frankie had learned about her recently. When threatened, Vanessa increased performance instead of honesty. You know, she said suddenly, Frankie always does this thing where he acts like he's secretly the smartest person in the room. Rachel laughed nervously. Oh my God, yes. Vanessa leaned back dramatically. He'll ask weirdly specific questions just to make people uncomfortable. Frankie folded his napkin calmly. Then he spoke for the first time in several minutes. Why are vendor payments routed through Bellcrest Holdings? The room froze. Not metaphorically. Actually froze. Even Derek stopped moving. Vanessa stared at Frankie. For 1 second, real panic crossed her face before disappearing behind anger. But Frankie's voice remained even. Bellcrest Holdings, LLC. Rachel looked between them uncertainly. Vanessa laughed sharply. Are you seriously doing this here? Frankie held her gaze. It's a simple question. Vanessa placed her wine glass down harder than intended. I have no idea what you're talking about. Frankie watched her carefully. People telling truth usually became confused first. Liars became offended first. You signed the registration under your maiden name, Frankie said quietly. Derek frowned. Wait, what's Bellcrest? Vanessa ignored him completely. She kept staring at Frankie now. How long have you been spying on me? Interesting choice of word. Not, what are you talking about? Not, that's false. Spying, meaning she already understood the information existed. Frankie stayed calm. I review shared financial liabilities. That's not your business. It becomes my business when my retirement accounts secure the debt. Silence again. Rachel finally stepped in. Okay, this is getting inappropriate. Vanessa grabbed onto that immediately. Yes, thank you. She turned toward Elliot with a frustrated laugh. See what I deal with? But Elliot wasn't looking at her anymore. He was watching Frankie. Bellcrest Holdings controls vendor routing, he asked. Vanessa answered too fast. No. Frankie answered at the same time. Yes. The overlap hung heavily in the room. Vanessa's jaw tightened. Frankie doesn't understand how layered accounting works. Frankie finally looked directly at her. You used Bellcrest to move personal debt into Veil and Stone reporting. Rachel spoke quickly. That's a pretty serious accusation. Frankie nodded once. It is. Vanessa leaned forward suddenly. You know what I'm done with this. Her voice had changed now, sharper, less polished. You sit there acting morally superior because you work some miserable insurance job while I actually built something. Frankie didn't react. That irritated her more. You want to know the truth? She continued. You hate seeing me successful. Derek shifted in his seat. Vanessa. No, she snapped. I'm tired of pretending. People in nearby tables laughed loudly at something unrelated outside the room. The contrast felt strange, like two completely different realities existing side by side. Inside this room, something was breaking. Elliot finally spoke again. Do you currently have undisclosed liabilities attached to operational accounts? Vanessa stared at him. What? It's a direct question. Vanessa forced another smile. Absolutely not. Frankie noticed Elliot's expression carefully. Experienced investors listened less to answers and more to reaction timing, and Vanessa was drowning herself now. Frankie reached calmly toward his water glass. Then why did Fifth Third issue a lien review notice last month? Vanessa's eyes snapped toward him immediately. There. Fear. Real fear this time. How do you know about that? Frankie didn't answer. He didn't need to. Because Elliot Whitmore suddenly understood something critical. Frankie wasn't guessing. He had documentation. Vanessa realized Elliot understood it too. Her breathing changed slightly. Faster now. She laughed again, but the sound came thin. Oh my God, Frankie literally investigates me like I'm a criminal. Frankie rested both hands calmly on the table. I investigate risk. Rachel stood halfway from her chair. Okay, maybe everybody should calm down. But nobody moved. Elliot leaned forward slightly toward Frankie. "What exactly did you find?" Vanessa answered instantly. "Nothing." Frankie looked directly at Elliot. "Enough inconsistencies to pause due diligence." The words landed hard. Very hard. Vanessa stared at him in disbelief. "You unbelievable asshole!" Frankie remained still. The waiter approached carefully toward the doorway, holding dessert plates. Nobody acknowledged him. After several painful seconds, he quietly turned around and left. Vanessa lowered her voice now. Dangerously quiet. "You're trying to sabotage me." Frankie finally spoke with emotion for the first time all night. Not anger. Disappointment. "You forged my signature." That ended everything. No more performance, no more dinner energy, no more social masks. Rachel looked stunned. Derek slowly lowered his bourbon glass. Vanessa's face lost color instantly. Elliot sat perfectly still beside Frankie. The investor's expression hardened in a way Frankie recognized immediately. Legal awareness, financial exposure, risk calculation. Vanessa realized it too late. "That's not," Frankie interrupted softly. "Page 14 of the collateral authorization packet." Vanessa's mouth closed, because she knew exactly which document he meant. Nobody at the table spoke. Outside the window, rain rolled down the glass in silver streaks beneath downtown lights. Inside, the entire evening had shifted from social humiliation into something far more dangerous. Finally, Elliot reached slowly into the inside pocket of his suit jacket and removed a slim leather business card holder. He placed one card carefully beside Frankie's iced tea. "Would you be available Monday morning?" he asked calmly. Vanessa stared at Elliot in shock. "Elliot." But he ignored her completely. Frankie looked down at the card. "Whitmore Strategic Ventures. Private equity and risk advisory." Then he looked back at Elliot. "Yes," Frankie said quietly. Vanessa's breathing became uneven now, because for the first time all night she realized the room no longer belonged to her. The dinner ended 23 minutes later. Not officially, nobody announced it, but the energy collapsed so completely that everyone began pretending they suddenly had somewhere else to be. Rachel Monroe was the first to stand. "Well," she said awkwardly while grabbing her purse, "this definitely became intense." Nobody answered her. Derek drained the rest of his bourbon in one swallow and muttered something about an early meeting in the morning. Vanessa stayed seated, rigid, perfect posture, but Frankie could see the tension in her jaw now. The stillness wasn't composure anymore. It was containment. Elliot Whitmore signed the dinner receipt without speaking much further. The investor remained polite, calm, professional, which somehow made everything colder. Frankie stood slowly and reached for his old brown jacket hanging behind the chair. Vanessa finally looked up at him. "What exactly is wrong with you?" she asked quietly. Frankie slipped one arm into the jacket sleeve. "Nothing." That was humiliating. Frankie met her eyes for the first time since the confrontation. "You called me dead weight in front of investors." Vanessa laughed sharply. "Oh, please, don't act wounded now." Frankie said nothing, because the strange part was she was right about one thing. He didn't feel wounded anymore. That stage had passed weeks ago. Now he mostly felt tired. Tired in the deep structural way buildings became tired before collapse. Outside the restaurant, cold November air rolled through downtown Columbus in damp waves. Valet attendants moved quickly beneath the covered entrance while headlights reflected across rain-dark pavement. Frankie stepped outside alone first. The city smelled like wet concrete and traffic exhaust. He buttoned his jacket slowly while waiting near the curb. Behind him, laughter spilled faintly from the restaurant bar upstairs, disconnected from the disaster that had just happened inside the private dining room. A valet attendant jogged toward him. Gray Camry Frankie nodded. The young attendant disappeared toward the lower garage ramp. Frankie slid both hands into his jacket pockets and looked across High Street toward the glowing office towers downtown. Quiet, cold, steady. Then the restaurant doors opened behind him. Elliot Whitmore stepped outside, alone. Frankie heard the doors close softly again. For several seconds, neither man spoke. Traffic lights changed at the intersection ahead, washing red reflections across the wet pavement. Finally, Elliot exhaled once. "You weren't bluffing in there. It wasn't a question." Frankie looked toward the street. "No." Elliot studied him carefully. How long have you known? About 6 months. And you stayed? Frankie considered the question honestly, long enough to understand what I was looking at. Elliot nodded slightly. That answer seemed to make sense to him. Inside the restaurant window upstairs, Frankie could see movement behind the glass. Vanessa pacing near the table, Rachel talking quickly beside her. She never disclosed any of this, Elliot said quietly. Frankie looked toward him. I believe that. The investor slipped one hand into his coat pocket. My firm already completed preliminary financial review. Frankie stayed silent. We found inconsistencies, Elliot admitted. Nothing strong enough to kill negotiations yet. Frankie nodded once, because partial truth was exactly how sophisticated fraud survived. Not through perfection, through plausible explanations. Elliot glanced toward the restaurant windows again. Forged signatures change things. Yes, you have proof. Frankie looked toward the approaching headlights of his Camry being pulled carefully beneath the entrance awning. Yes. The valet parked the car and stepped out quickly. Frankie handed him a $20 bill automatically. Thank you, sir. The attendant walked off. Elliot watched the old Camry for a second. Not mockingly, thoughtfully. You really drive this thing everywhere. Frankie looked at the cracked dashboard visible through the windshield. It runs. A faint smile almost appeared on Elliot's face. Then it disappeared again. You know, Elliot said quietly, most people would have exploded at dinner tonight. Frankie rested one hand on the roof of the Camry. Most people think emotional reactions solve things. And you don't. Frankie looked toward the city again. In my line of work, people usually destroy themselves if you give them enough space. The investor stayed silent after that. A black Escalade pulled beneath the valet entrance nearby. Two men in expensive suits climbed out laughing loudly while checking phones. Normal Friday night. Nobody around them knew two lives had just started collapsing upstairs. Elliot finally reached inside his coat pocket again. This time he removed a folded document, one page only. He handed it toward Frankie. Public lien filing, he said. Filed 3 weeks ago. Frankie took the paper carefully. Fifth Third Bank. Commercial Debt Review Notice. Bellcrest Holdings, LLC connected indirectly through collateral exposure. Frankie already knew about the filing, but the fact Elliot carried a physical copy told him something important. The investor had already started digging before tonight. Your team found this during due diligence? Frankie asked. Yes. And you still came tonight? Elliot looked toward the glowing restaurant windows. I wanted to evaluate the person before making a decision. Frankie understood immediately. Investors often trusted instinct after numbers stopped making sense, and Vanessa had performed disastrously tonight. Elliot lowered his voice slightly. She lied too comfortably. Frankie folded the document carefully once. Yes. She also underestimated you. That almost made Frankie laugh. Almost. Instead, he opened the passenger door and placed the paper gently onto the seat beside a stack of grocery receipts and an old thermos cup. The contrast between the document and the inside of the car felt strangely symbolic. Corporate fraud beside fast food napkins. Elliot leaned lightly against the curb railing. What exactly do you think she's hiding? Frankie answered honestly. I don't know the full number yet. The investor looked at him sharply. Yet. Not maybe. Not probably. Yet. Frankie continued quietly. But I know the reporting structure is manipulated. How? Debt cycling. Artificial revenue stabilization. Possible collateral fraud. Elliot's expression hardened more with every sentence. You documented all this as... How organized? Frankie looked at him calmly. Enough. A long silence followed. Rainwater dripped steadily from the awning overhead onto the pavement beside them. Then Elliot asked the question Frankie had already expected. Would you be willing to show my legal team? Frankie studied him carefully before answering. Not emotionally, professionally. Because intention mattered. What happens if I do? Elliot didn't hesitate. If the evidence holds, the investment stops immediately. Frankie nodded slowly, and Vanessa Elliott's face remained unreadable. If financial fraud exists, lawyers handle it. There it was. Not revenge. Process. Frankie respected that. People who understood systems rarely needed drama. The law itself became heavy enough eventually. Behind the restaurant windows upstairs, Vanessa suddenly appeared near the glass. Even from this distance, Frankie recognized the tension in her movements. She saw them talking, saw the document in Frankie's hand, saw Elliot standing beside him instead of beside her. And for the first time that evening, Frankie thought she might finally understand something important. The quiet man she spent years dismissing had never actually been weak, only patient. Elliot straightened slightly. Monday morning, 8:30. Frankie nodded. We're Whitmore Strategic, top floor, East Broad. Frankie memorized the address automatically. Elliot extended his hand. Frankie shook it once. Firm, short, professional. Then the investor looked toward the restaurant one final time. She's going to panic tonight. Frankie opened the driver's side door slowly. Yes. You worried about that? Frankie paused before getting inside. Rain rolled softly across the windshield beneath the downtown lights. No, he said quietly. I'm worried about what she'll destroy before Monday. Elliot studied him for several seconds. Then he gave one slow nod, because now he understood something else too. Frankie Gonzales hadn't come to dinner angry. He had come prepared. Whitmore Strategic Ventures occupied the top 3 floors of a black glass tower on East Broad Street. The lobby alone probably cost more than Frankie's entire house. Polished marble floors, silent elevators, a reception desk made from dark walnut and brushed steel. Everything about the building communicated controlled money, not flashy wealth, old systems, structured power. Frankie arrived Monday morning at 8:12 a.m. wearing a charcoal button-down shirt, dark slacks, and the same brown leather watch Vanessa used to mock. He carried one black document case. Nothing expensive, nothing dramatic. But inside the case sat 6 months of organized evidence. A young receptionist greeted him politely. Mr. Gonzales? Frankie nodded. Mr. Whitmore is expecting you. She pressed a button beneath the desk. A moment later, the private elevator doors opened silently. Frankie stepped inside alone. As the elevator climbed, he watched downtown Columbus disappear beneath morning fog through the glass wall behind him. The city looked smaller from above, simpler. By the time the elevator reached the executive floor, Frankie had already slowed his breathing deliberately. Not because he was nervous, because emotional control mattered during presentations like this, especially when the information could destroy people. The elevator doors opened directly into a private reception area lined with abstract art and floor-to-ceiling windows overlooking the Scioto River. Elliot Whitmore stood near a conference room entrance, speaking quietly with 2 attorneys. He turned as Frankie approached. Morning. Morning. Elliot introduced the others immediately. Dana Keller, corporate counsel. A woman in her 50s shook Frankie's hand firmly. Martin Reeves, financial compliance. The older man beside her nodded once without smiling. Frankie recognized the type instantly. People who spent careers cleaning up expensive disasters. No small talk followed. Elliot gestured toward the conference room. Let's begin. Inside the room felt almost unnaturally clean. Long black conference table, glass walls, perfectly aligned notebooks, fresh coffee untouched near the center. Frankie placed his document case carefully onto the table and opened it. No theatrics, no speeches, only folders, labeled, chronological, structured. Dana Keller watched him closely. You organized this yourself, yes? Frankie slid the first binder across the table. Personal account transfers. Second binder. Business liability exposure. Third, forged collateral documentation. Martin Reeves opened the first binder slowly. Within minutes, the atmosphere inside the room changed. Not emotionally, professionally. Frankie recognized the shift immediately. People stopped evaluating him and started evaluating risk. Dana flipped carefully through printed bank transfers highlighted with colored tabs. These are verified copies. Yes, you obtained them legally. They're attached to shared marital accounts. Martin adjusted his glasses while studying spreadsheets. Jesus. Nobody reacted to the curse. Elliot remained standing near the window, reviewing one of the forged signature pages. How confident are you this signature was fabricated? Dana asked. Frankie slid another document forward calmly. Comparison samples from mortgage filings, tax returns, and prior banking authorizations. Dana placed both signatures side by side. Even from across the table, the differences became obvious. Pressure inconsistencies, angle variance, stroke hesitation. Martin leaned back heavily in his chair. "This is exposure," he muttered. Frankie remained silent. He had spent years inside commercial litigation rooms learning something important. The strongest evidence usually spoke best without commentary. Dana turned another page. "These vendor invoices are fake." Frankie nodded once. "Most likely internally generated. You verified that?" "Yes." How Frankie opened another folder. Metadata timestamps, repeated formatting signatures, duplicate invoice architecture. Martin stared at him. "You found all this alone?" Frankie answered simply. "This is what I do." The older man slowly removed his glasses. For the first time since Frankie entered the room, someone looked at him with visible respect instead of curiosity. Elliot finally sat down across from him. "When exactly did you realize the projections were manipulated 3 weeks ago? Why not contact us immediately?" Frankie considered the question honestly. "Because I needed certainty." Dana nodded faintly at that answer. Legal professionals understood certainty. Accusations destroyed people. Documentation protected you. Martin opened another binder. "Bellcrest Holdings," he said quietly. "This shell company routes debt into operational liquidity reporting." "Yes." "You traced all transfers?" "Most." Martin looked toward Elliot. "If these records hold up under forensic review, your investment exposure could have been catastrophic." Elliot rested both hands together on the table. "How catastrophic?" Dana answered before Martin could. "Civil liability minimum. Potential fraud implications depending on disclosure intent." The room fell quiet again. Frankie noticed something interesting then. Nobody asked if Vanessa was a good person. Nobody discussed emotions. Because inside rooms like this, systems mattered more than personalities. Numbers either aligned or they didn't, and Vanessa's numbers were collapsing fast. Dana looked back toward Frankie. "Did she know you were documenting this no machad? When did she realize Friday night?" Elliot exhaled slowly. "That explains the panic." Frankie said nothing. His phone buzzed inside his pocket, then again, then again. He didn't need to check the screen to know it was Vanessa. 48 missed calls since Saturday morning. 23 text messages, 2 voicemails. He had listened to none of them. Martin opened another folder. Retirement collateral exposure. He shook his head slowly. "This is reckless," Frankie corrected him quietly. "No. Reckless is accidental." Dana looked up immediately. "You believe it was intentional?" Frankie held her gaze calmly. "Yes." Nobody spoke after that, because intention changed legal strategy entirely. Elliot finally leaned back in his chair. "I want internal verification completed today." Dana nodded. "We'll need digital copies immediately." Frankie reached into the document case and placed 2 encrypted flash drives onto the table. "Everything's indexed." Martin stared at the drives briefly. "You prepared this like litigation," Frankie answered without emotion. "I assumed eventually it would become litigation." Elliot almost smiled at that. Almost. The conference room doors suddenly opened. The receptionist stepped inside carefully. Mr. Whitmore Elliot turned. "There's a Vanessa Gonzales here insisting she has a meeting." Silence. Frankie didn't move. Elliot's expression hardened instantly. "Did anyone schedule her?" "No, sir." Dana closed the binder slowly. "Well," she said quietly, "that was fast." Frankie looked toward the windows overlooking downtown Columbus. Far below, morning traffic crawled through wet streets beneath gray skies. Predictable. Orderly. Systems. He understood systems. And systems always reacted the same way once pressure exposed structural weakness. People panicked, especially people who built lives around image control. Elliot stood slowly. "Do not allow her into this room yet." The receptionist nodded quickly and disappeared. Martin rubbed one hand across his face. "If she already knows the investment is being reviewed, she's going to start destroying records." Frankie answered immediately. "She already has." All 3 executives looked toward him. Frankie reached into the document case again and removed one final folder. Cloud backup confirmations. Time-stamped. Remote archive certifications. Off-site legal duplication records. Dana stared at him for several seconds. You really thought through every step. Frankie closed the folder calmly. I work in fraud exposure. Elliot looked toward the conference room doors where muffled arguing had already started faintly outside. Then back toward Frankie. What happens next, he said quietly, depends entirely on how much damage she's already done. Frankie listened to Vanessa's raised voice echo faintly through the executive hallway. Then he looked down at the organized binders covering the table. 6 months of silence. 6 months of preparation. 6 months of watching his marriage become evidence. And now, for the first time, Frankie realized something strange. He no longer felt emotionally attached to the outcome, only responsible for telling the truth before someone else got destroyed by the same lies. Then the conference room doors opened again, and Vanessa Gonzales walked in. Vanessa Gonzales entered the conference room like someone trying to outrun disaster through confidence alone. Cream-colored coat, large sunglasses still pushed into her hair despite the gray morning outside. Designer handbag clutched tightly against her side. Everything about her appearance said control. Everything about her breathing said panic. She stopped the second she saw the binders spread across the conference table. Her eyes moved quickly. Bank statements, highlighted transfers, legal tabs, flash drives. Then finally Frankie. For one brief moment, real fear crossed her face. Not fear of losing him, fear of losing the narrative. Elliot, she said quickly, forcing a smile. I'm glad I caught you before this got completely out of hand. Nobody invited her to sit. That mattered. Frankie noticed Dana Keller close one binder quietly while watching Vanessa with the same detached focus attorneys reserved for unstable witnesses. Vanessa turned toward Frankie first. What exactly are you doing? Frankie remained seated, answering questions. You blindsided me. Frankie looked at the forged signature pages resting near the center of the table. You used my name. Vanessa ignored that completely. Instead, she pivoted toward Elliot. This is personal, she said. Frankie's angry because our marriage has problems. Elliot rested both hands calmly on the table. Did you forge collateral authorization documents? Vanessa blinked. What? It's a direct question. Dana slid a highlighted page slowly across the table. Vanessa looked down at it. Frankie watched her eyes carefully. Recognition came instantly. Then calculation. Then performance. That's ridiculous, she said lightly. Martin Reeves spoke for the first time since she entered. We've already identified signature inconsistencies. Vanessa laughed sharply. Oh my God, you people are actually entertaining this. Frankie noticed she still hadn't denied creating Bellcrest Holdings. Important. Very important. Because guilty people often defended emotional accusations first while avoiding technical ones. Vanessa placed her handbag onto the conference table. This is exactly what Frankie does, she said. He twists paperwork until everything sounds criminal. Frankie stayed silent. Elliot looked toward her evenly. Do you currently have undisclosed debt exposure attached to Vale and Stone? Number Martin opened another folder immediately. Then, why does Bellcrest Holdings route personal liabilities into operational revenue stabilization? Vanessa turned toward him. You don't understand startup accounting. Martin didn't react. I understand forensic compliance. That hit harder than shouting would have. Vanessa looked back toward Elliot quickly. Look, early-stage businesses move money creatively sometimes. That's normal. Dana folded her hands together, not through concealed shell structures tied to marital collateral. Vanessa's breathing became uneven again. Frankie noticed the tiny changes. Her shoulders tighter now, voice slightly faster. She was losing rhythm. People built around image control depended heavily on rhythm. Once it cracked, everything underneath started showing. Vanessa pointed suddenly toward Frankie. He's been stalking my finances for months, Frankie finally answered. We share legal liability. That doesn't give you the right to investigate me. Frankie held her gaze calmly. You forged my signature. Again, she didn't deny it directly. Instead, she stepped closer toward Elliot. This is what happens when insecure men feel threatened. Elliot's expression didn't move. You represented Vale and Stone as financially stable during active investment review. Because it is stable, Dana opened another page. Then explained the unpaid payroll tax exposure. Silence. Vanessa stared at the documents. Frankie saw the exact second she realized the investigation had already gone deeper than she expected. Her confidence dropped noticeably after that. She turned toward Frankie, again, lower voice now. You gave them all this? Yes. You betrayed me. Frankie almost responded emotionally then. Almost. But years of litigation work had trained him to separate feelings from facts under pressure. So instead he answered quietly, You involved me before I involved them. Vanessa looked stunned for a second. Not because of the words, because he said them without anger. That frightened her more. People understood rage. Calmness during collapse felt unnatural. Elliot stood slowly from his chair and walked toward the windows overlooking downtown Columbus. Rain moved softly across the glass. Below them, traffic flowed steadily through morning intersections. Normal city, normal people. Completely unaware, a $750,000 investment had just turned into a legal containment situation. Without turning around, Elliot asked, How much debt actually exists? Vanessa hesitated too long. Martin answered instead. Based on current exposure, potentially several $100,000. Vanessa spun toward him immediately. That's not true. Then provide audited disclosures. I don't have final audits yet. Dana spoke next. Do you have verified accounting? Yes. Produce it. Vanessa froze. That was the problem with lies. Eventually, systems demanded documentation, and systems were patient. Frankie watched her carefully now, not like a husband, like an investigator observing structural failure. Vanessa looked around the room desperately. No allies, no admiration, no audience willing to laugh at Frankie anymore. Rachel wasn't here to rescue conversations. Derek wasn't here making nervous jokes. This room operated differently. Facts only. Finally, Vanessa tried a different strategy. Softness. Her voice lowered suddenly. Elliot, I think Frankie's deliberately trying to destroy my company because our marriage is ending. Elliot turned slowly from the windows. Is your marriage ending? Vanessa looked toward Frankie. For the first time all morning, uncertainty crossed her face, because she genuinely didn't know anymore. Frankie answered before she could. Yes. The word landed quietly. No drama, no threat, just certainty. Vanessa stared at him. You're serious? Frankie didn't answer, because seriousness no longer needed explanation. Dana closed another binder carefully. Given the current information, she said professionally, I'm recommending immediate suspension of all investment activity pending full forensic review. Vanessa looked toward Elliot sharply. You can't seriously be considering that. Elliot's voice remained calm. I don't invest in uncertainty. This isn't uncertainty. This is a bitter husband. Frankie said nothing. Martin slid another document across the table. Fifth Third Lien Review Notices. Hidden Credit Obligations. Cross-collateral exposure summaries. Vanessa's face lost more color with every page. You accessed private records illegally, she whispered toward Frankie. No, Frankie answered calmly. I accessed shared liability. Dana finally looked directly at Vanessa. Did you disclose Bellcrest Holdings during due diligence? Vanessa said nothing. That's material omission, Martin said quietly. The room went still again. Frankie noticed Elliot studying Vanessa now with complete emotional distance. The admiration from Friday night was gone entirely. All that remained was risk assessment. And Vanessa realized it. Panic finally started replacing performance. You're blowing this completely out of proportion, she said quickly. Every business manipulates cash flow during scaling. Not like this, Dana replied. Vanessa looked toward Frankie one last time. I trusted you. Frankie met her eyes evenly. No, he said quietly. You trusted me to stay quiet. That one hurt. He could see it immediately, because it was true. Vanessa stepped backward slowly from the conference table. For a moment, nobody spoke. Then Elliot made the decision. Whitmore Strategic Ventures is formally suspending all investment negotiations with Vail and Stone, effective immediately. The sentence landed with surgical precision. Professional. Final. Vanessa stared at him. You're walking away. I'm protecting my firm. You're making a mistake. Elliot shook his head once. No, I almost made one. Silence. Outside the windows, rain continued falling softly across downtown Columbus. Inside the conference room, Vanessa stood completely alone for the first time in years. No social charm, no applause, no carefully managed image. Just evidence. Frankie closed the final binder calmly and returned it to the document case. Then his phone buzzed again across the table. This time it wasn't Vanessa calling. It was Adrian Pike, divorce attorney. Frankie looked at the screen briefly before silencing it again. Vanessa noticed the name instantly, and suddenly she understood something even worse than losing the investment. Frankie hadn't started preparing Friday night. He had started preparing months ago. Frankie arrived home at 6:17 p.m. The sky over Briarwood Lane had already turned dark blue beneath heavy November clouds, and cold wind pushed dead leaves across the quiet suburban street. His gray Camry rolled slowly into the driveway. The garage door was open. That stopped him immediately. Vanessa never left the garage open. Frankie killed the engine but stayed seated for several seconds, hands resting lightly on the steering wheel. The house looked normal from outside. Porch light glowing, kitchen window illuminated. No broken glass. No visible damage. But experience had taught Frankie something important years earlier during commercial investigations. People rarely destroyed evidence dramatically. Usually they destroyed it quickly, quietly, desperately. He stepped out of the car calmly and walked into the garage. Storage bins sat open across the floor. Cardboard boxes overturned. Metal filing cabinet drawers half pulled open. Frankie looked toward the folding table in the corner. Empty. The binders were gone. Inside the house, something crashed loudly upstairs. Frankie closed the garage door behind him without rushing. Then he walked through the kitchen. Cabinet doors hung open. Papers covered the granite island. Vanessa moved upstairs above him, footsteps sharp and frantic across hardwood floors. Frankie loosened his jacket slowly and hung it over the back of a chair. Then he climbed the stairs. Their bedroom looked like a storm had passed through it. Closet doors wide open, suitcases on the floor, desk drawers emptied onto the carpet. Vanessa stood beside the bed, shoving stacks of documents into a trash bag. She spun around the second she saw him. "You gave them everything." Frankie looked at the trash bag. Shredded papers, bank records, tax forms. "Most of those are copies," he said calmly. Vanessa stared at him in disbelief. "You ruined my company." Frankie looked around the room slowly. "No," he answered quietly. "I documented it." Vanessa threw another stack of papers into the bag aggressively. "You had no right." Frankie noticed burn marks inside the small bathroom sink nearby. She had already tried destroying records. Too late. Cloud backups, encrypted drives, legal duplication, everything preserved. "You think this makes you some kind of hero?" Vanessa snapped. Frankie leaned lightly against the bedroom doorway. "I'm not trying to be a hero." "Then what are you trying to be?" Frankie looked at her carefully. For years, he had spent enormous emotional energy trying to understand Vanessa's moods, her frustrations, her ambitions, her anger. Tonight, he felt strangely detached from all of it, like the marriage had already ended somewhere internally long before either of them admitted it aloud. Finally, he answered, protected. That seemed to hit her harder than shouting would have. Vanessa laughed bitterly. "Protected from me?" Frankie's eyes moved briefly toward the burned paper fragments inside the bathroom sink. "Yes." Silence stretched between them. Outside rain tapped softly against the bedroom windows. Vanessa crossed her arms tightly. "You embarrassed me in front of Elliot." Frankie almost reacted to the sentence. Not because it hurt, because even now, after everything, her priority was humiliation. Not fraud. Not forged signatures. Not destroyed finances. Image. Always image. "You forged legal documents," Frankie said quietly. Vanessa rolled her eyes dramatically. "Oh my God, enough with the signature. You used my retirement collateral. It was temporary. You hid debt under shell accounts. That's how startups survive." Frankie studied her carefully. No remorse, only justification. And somehow that made everything easier. Because guilt complicated endings. Certainty simplified them. Vanessa suddenly stepped closer. You know what your real problem is? She asked coldly. You hate seeing me become more successful than you. Frankie looked toward the dresser mirror behind her. Their reflections stared back together like strangers sharing the same room. No, he said calmly. I hate watching you destroy everything to impress people. That landed. Vanessa's expression tightened instantly. Easy for you to say. You've spent your whole life hiding. Frankie said nothing. Hiding in routines. Hiding in spreadsheets. Hiding in safe little jobs while other people actually take risks. Frankie walked slowly toward the nightstand and picked up a framed photo from years earlier. Chicago Riverwalk. Summer. Vanessa smiling naturally beside him before ambition turned into performance. He looked at the photo quietly for several seconds, then set it face down. Vanessa watched him carefully now. For the first time all day, uncertainty started creeping into her voice. What happens now? Frankie reached into his jacket pocket slowly. Vanessa's eyes narrowed immediately. When he removed the thick manila envelope, her breathing changed. No, she whispered. Frankie placed the envelope gently on the bed between them. Adrian Pike and Associates, Family Law Division. Vanessa stared at it without touching it. You already hired an attorney. Yes. How long ago? Frankie answered honestly. 3 weeks. The room went completely silent, because that answer revealed something devastating. This wasn't reaction anymore. It was preparation. Vanessa looked physically shaken now. You planned this. Frankie met her eyes evenly. I planned for reality. Vanessa grabbed the envelope suddenly and ripped it open. Legal papers slid partially onto the bedspread. Petition for dissolution of marriage. Financial protection motions. Asset preservation requests. Emergency liability separation review. Highlighted sections marked with yellow tabs. Vanessa flipped pages faster, then stopped abruptly. Her eyes locked onto one document. Frankie already knew which one. The forged authorization page. Highlighted, annotated, compared beside verified signature samples. Vanessa looked up slowly. You're actually doing this? Frankie nodded once. Yes. She laughed weakly in disbelief. After 14 years. Frankie looked around the bedroom again. Designer handbags, luxury shoes, expensive cosmetics spread across marble counters, thousands of dollars purchased through hidden debt structures. We stopped being married before today, he said quietly. Vanessa stared at him for several seconds. Then anger returned suddenly because anger felt stronger than fear. You think people are going to side with you? She snapped. You think anybody sees you as the victim? Frankie shrugged lightly. I'm not interested in victims. You always do this. Do what act emotionally detached so you can feel superior. Frankie almost answered immediately, then stopped. Because something about the accusation felt partially true, not superiority. Distance. Frankie had learned emotional distance professionally long before he used it personally. Insurance litigation destroyed naive people quickly. You couldn't survive years inside fraud investigations if every lie affected you emotionally. Eventually, you learned to separate evidence from feelings. The problem was that skill had followed him home. Vanessa stepped toward him again. What exactly did you tell Elliot? The truth. You ruined the investment. No, Frankie answered quietly. Your records did. Vanessa's jaw tightened. You wanted this. Frankie looked directly at her. No, he said. I wanted you to stop before it became criminal. The sentence hit hard. Because somewhere deep beneath the anger, Vanessa understood he meant it. He had stayed silent for months, not out of weakness, but because he kept hoping she would pull herself back before the damage became irreversible. Instead, she escalated, again and again, until systems got involved. Banks, investors, lawyers. Now the process had started, and processes didn't care about charm. Downstairs, Frankie's phone buzzed on the kitchen counter faintly. Probably Adrian, probably more legal coordination. The sound echoed softly through the house. Vanessa sat slowly onto the edge of the bed. For the first time in years, she looked tired instead of polished. What if I fix it? She asked quietly. Frankie studied her face carefully. Interesting question. Not, What if we fix this? What if I fix it? Meaning the business still came first, always. Frankie answered honestly. I don't think you know how anymore. Vanessa looked down at the divorce papers resting in her lap. Rain continued falling softly outside the bedroom windows while darkness settled deeper across Briarwood Lane. Then Frankie noticed something inside the half-open closet, a second black trash bag, filled with shredded financial records. And sitting directly on top of the torn papers was a partially burned folder labeled Whitmore Strategic Ventures. The deposition room sat on the 14th floor of a downtown Columbus law office overlooking the Franklin County Courthouse. Gray walls, muted carpet, long walnut table beneath fluorescent lighting that made everyone look tired. Frankie arrived 20 minutes early, carrying the same black document case he had carried into Whitmore Strategic Ventures 3 weeks earlier. Outside the conference room windows, February snow drifted slowly across the city. Inside, everything smelled like burnt coffee and printer toner. Adrian Pike stood near the end of the table, reviewing notes from a yellow legal pad. Tall, precise, mid-50s, the kind of attorney who never raised his voice because he never needed to. You sleep at all? Adrian asked quietly. Frankie loosened his coat. Some? Adrian nodded once. Good. That was the entire emotional check-in. Frankie appreciated that. People who worked around legal systems understood something most others didn't. Calm mattered more than outrage. Across the hallway, Vanessa's legal team arrived 15 minutes later. Rachel Monroe entered first, carrying 2 thick binders against her chest. Behind her walked Vanessa. Black suit, hair perfectly styled, expression carefully controlled. She looked polished enough for television. Frankie noticed she had lost weight, not dramatically, but enough to show stress beneath the surface. Vanessa saw him immediately. Neither spoke. Rachel did enough talking for both of them. This doesn't need to become a circus, she said sharply while organizing papers. Adrian barely looked up. Then your client shouldn't have forged financial documents. Rachel's jaw tightened. Allegedly. Frankie sat quietly near the center of the table. Outside the room, attorneys moved through hallways carrying coffee cups and legal boxes. Routine weekday noise, routine legal business. But Frankie understood how quickly ordinary rooms became dangerous once sworn testimony started. A court reporter entered next. Then the videographer. Then the formal introductions began. By 9:03 a.m., the deposition was officially on record. Rachel started aggressively. Of course she did. That had always been her style. She leaned forward slightly toward Frankie. Mr. Gonzales, would you describe yourself as emotionally distant in your marriage? Frankie looked at her calmly. I don't know. Your wife claims you frequently withdrew from communication. Frankie folded his hands together on the table. We communicated. Rachel glanced toward her notes. Did you bring spreadsheets to couples therapy sessions? Adrian objected immediately. Relevance. Rachel ignored him. Frankie answered anyway. Yes. Rachel smiled slightly like she had scored a point. And would you agree that behavior is unusual? Frankie looked toward the snowy courthouse outside the window before answering. The therapist requested documentation. Rachel paused. Small pause. Important pause. Because facts ruin narratives quickly. She shifted directions immediately. Did you resent your wife's professional success? No. Did you feel inferior financially? No. Rachel leaned closer. Did you intentionally interfere with Vale and Stone's investment opportunity? Frankie answered calmly. I disclosed financial misconduct. Rachel smiled tightly. That's not what I asked. Frankie met her eyes evenly. It's the truthful version. Silence stretched briefly across the room. The court reporter continued typing steadily. Click, click, click. Rachel flipped another page. Isn't it true you monitored Vanessa Gonzales obsessively for months? Frankie thought carefully before answering. I documented shared financial exposure without her knowledge. Yes. So secretly. Frankie looked toward her. Fraud investigations are rarely announced in advance. That landed harder than Rachel expected. Vanessa shifted uncomfortably beside her attorney. Rachel changed strategy again. You never confronted your wife emotionally before contacting Whitmore Strategic Ventures? No. Why not? Frankie answered honestly. Because emotions don't preserve evidence. Even Adrian looked briefly toward him after that answer, not surprised, just recognizing how completely Frankie had separated himself emotionally from the marriage collapse. Rachel exhaled slowly. You talk about your marriage like a business audit. Frankie remained still. That's what it became. Vanessa finally reacted. That's unbelievable. Her voice cracked slightly before she recovered control. Rachel placed one hand lightly on Vanessa's arm. Then she returned toward Frankie. You claim my client forged signatures. Yes. You're not a handwriting expert. No, so your opinion is speculation. Frankie reached calmly toward the document stack beside him. No. Adrian slid a folder across the table. Inside sat forensic comparison reports already prepared by independent analysts. Rachel's expression tightened immediately. Frankie watched the exact second she realized the case had progressed further than expected. Again. That kept happening lately. Vanessa underestimated preparation because she depended heavily on improvisation. Frankie depended on systems. Systems always move slower, but they move deeper. Rachel flipped through the forensic packet quickly. These reports were completed when last week Adrian answered. Vanessa turned sharply toward Frankie. You hired experts already. Frankie looked at her calmly. Yes. Something in her expression changed after that. Not anger, recognition, because now she understood fully Frankie had never been reacting. He had been building. Rachel recovered quickly. Mr. Gonzales, she continued, isn't it true? You wanted revenge after your marriage deteriorated? Frankie considered the question. No, you didn't want to hurt Vanessa professionally. No, you just accidentally destroyed her company. Frankie looked directly at her. The company destroyed itself. Silence again. Snow drifted softly outside the courthouse windows while traffic crawled slowly below through slush-covered streets. Inside the deposition room, Rachel finally moved toward financial details. Did you personally review Vale and Stone accounting records? Yes. What qualified you to do so? Frankie opened one folder carefully. 20 years of commercial audit certifications, litigation consulting contracts, insurance fraud exposure cases, expert witness credentials. Rachel stared at the documents for several seconds. Vanessa looked genuinely stunned. Frankie realized something then. Vanessa had spent years mocking his work without ever truly understanding it. She knew his routines, not his value. Rachel cleared her throat. You testified in fraud litigation cases. Yes. How many? 32. The room grew quieter after that, because suddenly Frankie no longer looked like a jealous husband meddling in finances. He looked exactly like what he was, an experienced fraud specialist who documented irregularities before exposing them. Rachel changed direction one final time. Did you ever attempt reconciliation? Frankie thought about that carefully. The question mattered more than it appeared. Yes, he answered quietly, when before legal exposure escalated. Vanessa looked down at the table. Frankie continued. I repeatedly asked her to disclose liabilities honestly. Rachel spoke quickly. And instead, you secretly prepared divorce proceedings. Frankie shook his head slightly. No. Then what did you prepare? Frankie looked toward the snow falling outside again. The truth. The room went silent. Not dramatic silence. Heavy silence. Because everybody inside that room understood something uncomfortable. Truth became dangerous when supported by documentation. Rachel finally closed her binder harder than intended. Then Adrian spoke for the first time in nearly 20 minutes. Let's discuss the collateral authorization signatures. Vanessa stiffened immediately. Adrian slid forward in large comparison photographs. Highlighted inconsistencies, pressure deviations, digital timestamp analysis. Then one final document. A sworn statement from Melissa Grant, Vale and Stone accounting consultant. Vanessa's face lost color instantly. Rachel grabbed the statement quickly. Where did you get this? Adrian answered calmly. Discovery. Frankie watched Vanessa carefully. Panic had returned. Real panic. Because Melissa Grant wasn't emotional evidence. She was operational evidence. An insider. Rachel skimmed the statement rapidly. then stopped reading. Very slowly, she lowered the pages onto the table. For the first time since the deposition began, Rachel Monroe looked uncertain. Vanessa noticed it too, and Frankie understood immediately what that meant. Something inside Melissa's statement was far worse than anyone expected. Melissa Grant testified 3 weeks later. By then, Columbus had started thawing into early March rain. Dirty snow still clung to sidewalks downtown, while gray clouds hung low above the courthouse district. Frankie arrived at the hearing room at 8:40 a.m., carrying coffee from a small diner 2 blocks away. Black coffee. No sugar. Same order for years. Routine steadied him. That mattered now more than ever. The hearing room felt colder than the deposition room had. Less polished. More procedural. The kind of room where careers quietly ended. Vanessa sat beside Rachel Monroe near the far end of the table, reviewing legal notes with restless movements. Her confidence had changed over the past month. Still polished, still controlled, but thinner now. Like expensive fabric stretched too tightly. Frankie noticed something else, too. No wedding ring. Not that it mattered anymore. Across the room, Nora Bellamy organized several large financial charts against portable easels. Forensic accountant, early 60s. Sharp eyes behind narrow silver glasses. Frankie liked her immediately because she spoke exactly like engineers usually did. Precise, unemotional, difficult to manipulate. Melissa Grant entered at 9:02 a.m. The moment she walked inside, Vanessa's entire posture stiffened. Melissa looked exhausted, dark circles under her eyes. Loose gray sweater, hair tied back carelessly. Not the appearance of someone enjoying cooperation. Frankie understood why. People like Melissa rarely entered fraud situations maliciously. Usually they entered gradually. Small compromises first, minor adjustments, temporary accounting tricks. Then one day they realized they were standing inside something criminal. Melissa sat carefully near the witness table. The clerk swore her in. Rachel immediately began damage control. "Ms. Grant," she said smoothly, "you were never officially employed by Vale and Stone. Creative, correct?" Melissa nodded. "Independent contractor. And your involvement with internal accounting was limited." Melissa hesitated. "Not exactly." Rachel's smile tightened slightly. "You primarily handled vendor reconciliation and financial reporting." Rachel flipped a page quickly. "Basic reporting." Melissa looked toward Vanessa briefly, then back toward the table. "No." Silence settled softly across the room. Rachel continued carefully. "Can you explain?" Melissa folded her hands together tightly. "I prepared revised revenue statements requested by Ms. Gonzales." Revised how? Another pause. Frankie watched Vanessa carefully. No anger yet, only tension. Melissa swallowed once. Revenue projections were adjusted to improve investor positioning. Rachel nodded quickly. "That's common in startup environments." Melissa looked down. "Not like this." The room became still. Nora Bellamy stopped organizing charts and listened quietly now. Rachel leaned forward. "What exactly do you mean?" Melissa exhaled slowly. Operational debt was concealed through Bellcrest Holdings. There it was. Out loud now. Officially recorded. Vanessa closed her eyes briefly. Frankie noticed the movement immediately. Tiny surrender. Rachel spoke faster. "Did Ms. Gonzales explicitly instruct you to conceal debt?" Melissa looked genuinely miserable, answering, "Yes." The words landed heavily. Not dramatic, just final. Frankie sat motionless beside Adrian Pike while the court reporter typed steadily. Click, click, click. Rachel changed strategy instantly. "Were you pressured by Frankie Gonzales to say this?" Melissa looked confused. "No." "Did he offer compensation?" "No." "Did he threaten legal action?" "No." Rachel's voice sharpened slightly. "So why cooperate now?" Melissa looked toward Vanessa again. For several seconds, nobody spoke. Then Melissa answered quietly, "Because it stopped being accounting." That sentence changed the room. Even Vanessa understood it. Rachel rubbed one hand against her temple. "Let's stay specific." Melissa nodded weakly. Nora Bellamy stepped forward then. "Permission to present forensic summary." "Granted." Nora placed the first chart onto the easel. Color-coded transfer lines connected personal accounts. Bellcrest Holdings and Vale and Stone operating balances. Even visually, the structure looked wrong, layered, circular, artificial. Nora spoke calmly. Over 11 months, approximately $312,000 moved through concealed liability channels. Vanessa shifted immediately. Rachel objected. Nora continued anyway. These movements created the appearance of operational liquidity during investor review periods. Frankie watched Elliot Whitmore seated quietly near the back of the hearing room. He attended personally now, no longer as potential investor, as witness. His face remained unreadable, but Frankie noticed Elliot never once looked toward Vanessa anymore, only the evidence. Nora replaced the first chart with another: credit exposure timelines, tax obligations, payroll deficiencies. Then the final number appeared: unpaid payroll taxes, $87,000. The room reacted visibly this time. Even Rachel looked shocked. Vanessa stared at the chart silently. Frankie realized something important then. She might not have fully understood how large the collapse had become either. Fraud grew that way sometimes, one compromise feeding another until the structure became too tangled to measure emotionally. Nora adjusted her glasses. In addition, she said calmly, multiple documents contained inconsistent signature verification. Rachel stood immediately. Objection to characterization. Nora didn't react. We submitted comparative analysis already entered into discovery. Frankie watched Melissa closely. The accountant looked physically sick now, not because she feared exposure, because she regretted participation. Big difference. Rachel turned toward Melissa sharply. Did you ever personally witness Vanessa Gonzales forge signatures? Melissa hesitated. Long hesitation. Then, yes. Silence. Absolute silence. Vanessa whispered immediately. That's not true. But the denial sounded weak. Rachel stepped closer toward Melissa. What exactly did you witness? Melissa rubbed trembling hands together. Frankie's authorization documents were rejected twice electronically. Frankie stayed perfectly still. Melissa continued quietly. Vanessa said delays would destroy the investment review timeline. Rachel interrupted quickly. You're assuming intent. Melissa shook her head slowly. No. Then she reached into her bag and removed a printed email chain. I kept copies. That ended it. Frankie saw the exact second Rachel realized the defense strategy had collapsed. Documentation. Always documentation. The email chain moved quickly between attorneys. Highlighted sections. Time-stamped instructions. One sentence circled in yellow. I'll handle Frankie's signature myself. Vanessa looked down at the table. Not angry anymore. Not defensive. Just cornered. Elliot Whitmore finally spoke from the back of the room. One sentence only. My firm would have invested based on those disclosures. Nobody answered him, because the implication was obvious. Without Frankie's intervention, Whitmore's strategic would have walked directly into financial fraud exposure. Nora placed one final chart onto the easel. Projected collapse timeline. Without external investment, Vale and Stone would likely have become insolvent within 7 months. Frankie studied the chart quietly. There it was. The truth stripped completely clean of emotion. Not ambition, not entrepreneurship, not misunderstanding. Collapse. Structured collapse, hidden beneath expensive branding and social performance. Rachel sat down slowly. For the first time since this started, she looked uncertain how to proceed. Vanessa stared blankly ahead. Outside the courthouse windows, rain slid slowly down the glass while traffic lights flickered red through wet downtown streets. Normal city, normal day. Inside Vanessa's carefully constructed image was dissolving piece by piece under fluorescent lights and sworn testimony. Then the judge reviewed several final filings quietly before looking toward both legal teams. Based on submitted evidence, he said calmly, civil fraud review appears warranted. The sentence landed like concrete. Vanessa finally looked toward Frankie then, not with anger, not even hatred, something worse, recognition. Because now she understood the full scale of what had happened. The quiet man she mocked for years had not beaten her emotionally. He had simply documented reality carefully enough that the system eventually did it for him. And systems were impossible to charm once evidence entered the room. Vanessa Gonzales made one final attempt to save herself in public. Frankie almost admired the instinct. Even after depositions, even after forensic reports, even after civil fraud review discussions, she still believed perception could outrun evidence. The networking gala took place at the Westin Great Southern Hotel in downtown Columbus on a humid April evening. Hundreds of local entrepreneurs, attorneys, investors, and corporate consultants filled the ballroom beneath gold chandeliers and dim amber lighting. 3 months earlier, Vanessa would have owned the room. Now people watched her carefully when she entered. Not openly, subtly. Whispers traveled differently through professional circles, quietly, efficiently. Frankie had no interest in attending, but Adrian Pike requested his presence because several witnesses connected to the Whitmore review process would also be there. So Frankie arrived at 7:18 p.m. wearing a dark navy suit he hadn't used in years. Simple tie, no designer labels, no performance. The valet attendant handed him his ticket while luxury cars lined the hotel entrance in polished rows beneath glowing streetlights. Inside the ballroom, jazz music drifted through clusters of conversations and clinking glasses. Frankie immediately noticed how people reacted to him now. Different. Before most barely registered his existence. Now conversations paused slightly when he walked past. Not admiration, awareness. People respected documented truth once systems validated it. Frankie disliked the attention immediately. He preferred invisibility. Near the ballroom entrance, Adrian handed him a bourbon. Frankie took one sip mostly to avoid refusing it. "You all right?" Adrian asked quietly. "Yes." "You don't look happy." Frankie glanced across the ballroom. Vanessa stood near the far bar speaking animatedly beside two startup founders. Beautiful as ever. Perfect posture, perfect smile. But something underneath looked strained now, like an actress repeating a role after forgetting why audiences once believed it. "I'm not here to win," Frankie said quietly. Adrian nodded once. "That's probably why you already did." Across the room, Vanessa spotted Frankie. Her expression shifted instantly. Not surprise. Calculation. Frankie recognized it immediately. She crossed the ballroom slowly, heels clicking softly against marble floors. Several people discreetly watched her approach. Drama attracted attention in rooms like this, even when nobody admitted it openly. "Frankie," she said smoothly once she reached him. "Vanessa." She looked him over carefully. "You clean up better than people think." Same instinct. Always performance. Always audience management. Frankie said nothing. Vanessa glanced toward Adrian briefly. "Can we talk privately?" Adrian immediately stepped away without comment. Frankie followed Vanessa toward a quieter hallway outside the ballroom, near framed historical photographs and empty banquet tables. The moment they stood alone, her entire demeanor changed. The smile disappeared instantly. "You've turned my life into a spectacle." Frankie leaned lightly against the wall. "No," he answered calmly. "The records did." Vanessa crossed her arms tightly. "You really enjoy saying that." "It's true." She laughed bitterly. "You know what people are saying about me?" Frankie looked toward the ballroom doors where muffled music continued softly behind them. "Yes. And you're okay with that?" Frankie considered the question honestly. "I stopped trying to control what people think months ago." Vanessa stared at him. "That's such bullshit. Maybe once it would have been. Not anymore." Vanessa stepped closer. "You could have handled this privately." Frankie looked at her calmly. "You forged legal documents tied to my financial exposure." Her eyes flashed immediately. "You keep repeating that like it justifies destroying everything." Frankie said nothing, because the strange part was he no longer wanted to destroy anything. The system was already doing that on its own. Vanessa lowered her voice. "Do you know how humiliating this has been?" Frankie almost answered emotionally. Almost. But then he remembered Hawthorne and Birch, her voice calling him dead weight, the laughter, the public humiliation delivered casually because she believed he was too weak to matter, and suddenly the emotion disappeared again. "You were comfortable humiliating me," he said quietly. "You just didn't expect consequences." That hit harder than anger. Vanessa looked away first. From inside the ballroom, applause suddenly erupted after some speaker finished a presentation. Normal event, normal evening. Meanwhile, their entire marriage stood in fragments inside a quiet hallway beside stacked catering trays. Vanessa exhaled sharply. You know what the worst part is? Frankie waited. You're acting morally superior now. Frankie looked at her carefully. No. Yes, you are. No, he repeated calmly. I'm acting finished. Silence. Real silence this time. Vanessa looked tired suddenly. Not glamorous, not powerful, just exhausted. Then she asked the question Frankie had started expecting from people lately. Did you ever actually love me? Interesting timing. Not during the marriage, not before the fraud exposure. Now. Frankie answered honestly. Yes. Vanessa's expression flickered slightly. Then how could you do this? Frankie looked directly at her, because eventually loving someone stops meaning protecting their lies. For several seconds she said nothing, then the ballroom doors opened behind them. Voices spilled into the hallway, and Elliot Whitmore stepped outside. The timing felt almost cruel. Vanessa stiffened immediately. Elliot wore a charcoal suit with no tie, one hand resting casually inside his pocket while he scanned the hallway. His eyes landed on Vanessa first, then Frankie. The investor nodded politely toward Frankie. Good to see you. Good to see you too. Vanessa forced a tight smile. Elliot. The investor acknowledged her with a slight nod. Nothing more. No warmth. No familiarity. That absence mattered more than hostility would have. Vanessa noticed it immediately. She straightened slightly. I was actually just explaining to Frankie that things have been exaggerated publicly. Elliot remained calm. Have they... Vanessa stepped toward him quickly. You know how legal narratives work? Elliot looked at her for several seconds before answering. No, he said quietly. I know how due diligence works. The hallway went still. Vanessa laughed weakly. You really believe Frankie over me? Elliot answered immediately. I believe documentation. That ended it. Frankie saw the exact moment Vanessa understood there would be no recovery through charm anymore. Not with Elliot. Not with legal systems. Not with people who reviewed evidence professionally. Her shoulders dropped slightly after that. Tiny movement, but final. Inside the ballroom, another round of applause echoed through the hotel while waiters carried trays of champagne beneath chandeliers. Business leaders kept networking. Conversations kept moving. Life continued normally around them. Vanessa looked between both men slowly. Then she said something Frankie would remember for years. You know what's funny? Nobody answered. You spent your whole marriage invisible, she said toward Frankie. And now the only reason anyone notices you is because I failed. Frankie studied her carefully. Then he shook his head once. No, he said quietly. People notice me because I stayed calm while you collapsed. Vanessa stared at him in silence. No comeback this time. No performance. Just reality landing slowly. Then Elliot checked his watch. We're needed back inside. Frankie nodded once. Vanessa didn't move. As Frankie and Elliot walked back toward the ballroom together, conversations near the entrance shifted subtly again. People watched. People whispered. But Frankie no longer cared, because for the first time in years he realized something peaceful. He didn't need anyone in these rooms to admire him anymore, only to stop mistaking silence for weakness. Behind him, Vanessa remained alone in the hallway beside the dim hotel lights, while the sound of applause continued somewhere far inside the ballroom. The divorce finalized on a Wednesday morning in June. No dramatic courtroom speeches, no shouting, no cinematic ending, just signatures, legal language, paperwork moving quietly across polished desks inside the Franklin County Courthouse. Frankie sat beside Adrian Pike wearing a light gray suit while ceiling fans hummed softly overhead. Across the room, Vanessa signed the final settlement documents without looking at him once. She looked different now. Still beautiful, still carefully dressed, but the sharp confidence that once filled every room around her had faded into something tighter and more guarded, like a person permanently bracing for impact. The judge reviewed the final paperwork calmly. Due to documented financial misconduct tied to concealed liabilities and forged collateral exposure, The court approved separation protections favoring Frankie. The Briarwood Lane house remained his, retirement protections remained intact. Business-related debt connected to Vale and Stone and Bellcrest Holdings stayed legally attached to Vanessa's liability structure. No celebration followed. Frankie didn't feel victorious, only lighter. That surprised him. For months, he expected anger to remain after everything ended. Instead, exhaustion left first, then tension, then the constant quiet anticipation of another lie. Outside the courthouse, early summer heat pressed against downtown Columbus, while traffic rolled steadily through afternoon intersections. Vanessa exited the building first beside Rachel Monroe without speaking. Frankie watched them disappear into the crowd. No hatred followed her. That part was over now. Adrian loosened his tie beside him. "You okay?" Frankie looked toward the courthouse steps crowded with attorneys and city workers carrying lunch bags. "Yeah." Adrian studied him carefully. "You don't sound convinced." Frankie considered that, then shrugged lightly. "I think I forgot what normal feels like." Adrian almost smiled. "That usually comes back slowly." The attorney handed him a thin folder. Final settlement copies, asset separation confirmations, protective liability rulings. Everything Frankie spent months documenting had ultimately done exactly what he hoped. Protected him from collapse that wasn't his. Nothing more, nothing less. As they walked toward the parking garage, Adrian spoke again. "You know, most people would have tried to destroy her publicly after all this." Frankie unlocked his Camry quietly. "I wasn't trying to destroy her." Adrian nodded once. "I know. That was the difference." Frankie never chased revenge emotionally. He only stopped shielding consequences. The summer passed quietly after that. Frankie returned to routines almost immediately. Morning coffee before work, grocery shopping every Sunday evening, quiet drives through downtown Columbus with financial radio humming softly through old speakers. The Briarwood house slowly changed too. Not dramatically, just calmer. Vanessa's designer furniture disappeared room by room after asset evaluations. The oversized, abstract paintings came down. The expensive wine subscriptions stopped arriving. Silence settled differently inside the house now. Cleaner, somehow. One Saturday morning, Frankie stood in the kitchen making eggs while sunlight moved softly across the countertops. For the first time in years, nobody criticized the cheap coffee maker. Nobody mocked his routines. Nobody rolled their eyes when he organized receipts beside the refrigerator. The peace felt unfamiliar at first, then addictive. A few weeks later, Frankie stopped at the neighborhood diner near Riverside Drive after work. Same booth, same black coffee, same elderly waitress named June, who always called everyone honey. He liked places where people behaved normally. No performance, no branding, no networking language, just tired people eating dinner quietly after work. Frankie sat near the window reviewing a grocery list when someone stopped beside the booth. Elliot Whitmore. The investor wore jeans this time instead of tailored suits, strange enough to almost make Frankie smile. "Mind if I sit?" Frankie gestured toward the opposite side of the booth. Elliot slid in and glanced around the diner. "This place is very different from Hawthorne and Birch. That's why I like it." June appeared instantly with a coffee pot. "What can I get you, sweetheart?" Elliot looked briefly confused before ordering black coffee. After she left, he studied Frankie for a moment. "You always come here most Thursdays." Elliot nodded slowly. "You know what's interesting?" Frankie waited. "You never actually changed through any of this." Frankie stirred cream into his coffee quietly. "Most people think calmness means passivity," Elliot continued. "But you were probably the most prepared person in every room." Frankie looked out the diner window toward evening traffic moving slowly through summer light. "Preparation isn't impressive," he said. "It's just useful." Elliot almost laughed. That answer explains a lot. For a while, neither man spoke. The diner television played muted baseball highlights overhead while silverware clinked softly around them. Eventually, Elliot reached into his jacket pocket and placed a business card on the table. Not the same one from Hawthorne and Birch. New title. Whitmore Risk Advisory Division. "We're expanding consulting operations," Elliot said. "Small business fraud prevention, financial exposure review, internal audit stabilization." Frankie looked at the card. Then at Elliot. You want me involved. I want someone who notices problems before headlines do. Frankie stayed quiet. The offer made sense professionally, but something inside him resisted returning to rooms full of wealthy people discussing risk over expensive bourbon. Elliot seemed to understand immediately. It's flexible, he added. Mostly independent consultation. Frankie nodded once. I'll think about it. You should. Elliot stood to leave, then paused beside the booth. For what it's worth, he said quietly, you probably saved my firm millions. Frankie looked up. I wasn't trying to save your firm. I know. That mattered too. After Elliot left, Frankie remained alone in the booth while evening sunlight faded slowly across the diner windows. June refilled his coffee without asking. You look happier lately, she said casually. Frankie almost answered automatically, then stopped. Because she was right. Not excited. Not triumphant. Just peaceful. There was a difference. Later that night, Frankie drove slowly back through Briarwood Lane with the windows partially down. Children rode bicycles beneath streetlights. Sprinklers clicked softly across summer lawns. Ordinary neighborhood. Ordinary life. For years, Frankie thought being underestimated was something painful to survive. Now he understood something different. Being underestimated gave quiet people time. Time to observe. Time to prepare. Time to understand who others truly became when nobody thought consequences existed. Frankie parked in the driveway and sat inside the Camry for a moment, listening to the engine tick softly as it cooled. No angry messages waiting on his phone, no hidden debt notifications, no performance waiting behind the front door. Just silence, steady silence, and for the first time in years it no longer felt lonely. Then his phone buzzed once in the cup holder. Unknown number. Frankie glanced down at the message. It contained only one sentence. You were right about everything, no signature attached, but he already knew who sent it. Frankie Gonzales accepted Elliot Whitmore's consulting offer 3 months later, not because he wanted prestige, not because he suddenly loved corporate environments, and definitely not because he wanted revenge to become a career. He accepted because the work made sense. Small businesses across Ohio were losing millions every year to internal fraud, hidden liabilities, manipulated reporting, and reckless financial expansion disguised as ambition. Frankie understood those patterns intimately now. Too intimately. Whitmore Risk Advisory gave him a modest office on the 18th floor overlooking downtown Columbus. Nothing extravagant, glass desk, 2 monitors, quiet lighting. Frankie personalized the space with almost nothing. One framed photograph of his late father, one black coffee maker, one small legal pad always centered perfectly beside the keyboard. The younger consultants inside the firm respected him almost immediately. Not because Frankie tried to impress anyone, because he didn't. That stood out in corporate environments more than confidence ever did. He listened carefully during meetings, spoke only when necessary, and noticed details others missed, a missing timestamp, an inconsistent vendor address, a financial projection growing too fast without operational support. Twice during his first month, Frankie identified exposure issues before legal review teams caught them. After the second time, Elliot stopped introducing him as a consultant. Now he introduced him as the calmest man in the building. Frankie disliked the description, but he understood what Elliot meant. Calmness wasn't personality anymore. It was discipline. One Thursday afternoon, Frankie finished reviewing a restaurant expansion audit and stepped into the hallway outside his office. 2 junior analysts stopped talking immediately when they saw him. Then one of them spoke awkwardly. Mr. Gonzales, Frankie looked toward them. Yeah, the younger man hesitated. We just wanted to say, your Bellcrest case is kind of legendary around here. Frankie almost sighed. Legendary. Interesting word for the collapse of a marriage. What exactly did you hear? He asked calmly. The analyst looked embarrassed immediately. Just that you uncovered a pretty sophisticated fraud structure. Frankie nodded once, then walked back into his office without continuing the conversation. Because that was the strange part about surviving public betrayal. Eventually, other people turned your worst experiences into stories, lessons, warnings, office mythology. But for Frankie, it still felt deeply personal. Some evenings he drove home through downtown Columbus and thought about how differently people treated him now. The same quiet man who once got laughed at over steak dinners suddenly seemed intelligent because systems had validated him publicly. That bothered him sometimes. Not emotionally, philosophically. People trusted confidence far too easily and dismissed patience far too quickly. One Friday evening in October, Frankie stopped again at the small diner near Riverside Drive. Same booth, same coffee, same waitress named June. The place looked exactly the same as it had before everything collapsed. That comfort mattered. June refilled his cup while country music played softly through ceiling speakers. "You work too much," she said casually. Frankie smiled faintly. "Probably. You seen anybody yet?" Frankie looked out the window toward orange streetlights reflecting across wet pavement. "No." June shrugged. "Well, less drama this way." Frankie almost laughed. Almost. His phone buzzed lightly against the table. Text message. Rachel Monroe. That surprised him. He opened it slowly. "I owe you an apology." Frankie stared at the screen for several seconds, then locked the phone without responding. Not out of bitterness, just distance. Some chapters didn't require revisiting once they ended. A few minutes later, the diner door opened again. Derek Holloway walked inside, carrying Rain across his shoulders. The moment he spotted Frankie, awkwardness flooded his face immediately. Frankie saw it happen in real time. Derek approached carefully. "Mind if I sit?" Frankie gestured toward the opposite booth seat. Derek slid in slowly. "I heard you're doing consulting work now." "Some." Derek rubbed his hands together nervously. "I've actually wanted to call you for months." Frankie waited quietly. Derek exhaled heavily. "We were pretty awful to you. Direct honesty. Rare." Frankie respected it immediately. Derek shook his head. "I keep thinking about that dinner. Hawthorne and Birch, the wine glasses, the laughter, dead weight." Frankie remembered every detail with perfect clarity. "I should have said something," Derek admitted quietly. Frankie looked down at the steam rising from his coffee cup. Most people don't interrupt humiliation when the room is enjoying it. Derek looked genuinely ashamed. "We thought you didn't care." Frankie nodded once. "I know. Because that was the mistake nearly everyone made." Calmness looked painless from the outside. Derek leaned back slowly. "For what it's worth, I didn't recognize Vanessa anymore near the end." Frankie stared through the diner window at passing headlights. Neither did I. Silence settled between them. Comfortable silence this time. Not tense, not performative. Just two tired men sitting in a quiet diner while rain tapped softly against glass. Eventually, Derek stood to leave. At the register near the door, Frankie noticed him quietly paying for both meals before walking back outside into the rain. No speeches, no dramatic redemption, just accountability. Frankie appreciated that more. Later that night, Frankie drove slowly through Briarwood Lane again. The neighborhood trees had started turning orange and gold beneath early autumn winds. His house looked smaller than he remembered, simpler too. Inside, the rooms felt peaceful now. No tension hiding beneath conversations, no constant performance, no pressure to become louder, just to matter. Frankie changed clothes, made tea, and sat alone on the back patio while cold air moved softly through the yard. For years, he thought silence meant invisibility. Now he understood silence could also mean stability. The world rewarded loud people quickly, but systems eventually revealed who was actually prepared when pressure arrived. Frankie looked up at the dark Ohio sky while distant traffic hummed softly somewhere beyond the neighborhood. He thought about Elliot, about Adrian, about Melissa Grant risking her career to tell the truth, about Vanessa standing alone in that hotel hallway after realizing charm no longer worked. Mostly, though, he thought about the younger version of himself sitting quietly at dinner tables believing endurance alone could save relationships. It couldn't. Truth mattered too, boundaries mattered, documentation mattered, and self-respect mattered long before collapse arrived. His phone buzzed once more beside the patio chair. Unknown number again. Frankie almost ignored it. Then he opened the message. "I'm leaving Ohio. I hope someday you find happiness. Vanessa." Frankie read the sentence once, then set the phone face down without replying. Not coldly, not angrily, simply finished. The wind moved softly through the backyard trees while the porch light glowed warmly behind him. And for the first time in years, Frankie realized something quietly important. He no longer needed anyone to understand his worth. Not Vanessa, not those dinner guests, not investors, not strangers, because peace arrived the moment he stopped defending himself to people committed to misunderstanding him. Life has a strange way of exposing people over time. The loudest person in the room often looks powerful in the beginning, but pressure eventually reveals who was actually prepared when things started falling apart. Frankie never won because he shouted louder. He won because he stayed patient long enough for the truth to become visible on its own. A lot of people watching this probably know what it feels like to be underestimated. Maybe you were the quiet one in the relationship. Maybe people mistook your calmness for weakness. Maybe someone only valued appearances while ignoring loyalty, discipline, and consistency. The hard truth is that not every betrayal needs revenge. Sometimes the strongest thing you can do is protect yourself properly and let reality speak for you. If you've ever been underestimated by someone close to you, leave a comment and share your story. And before you go, don't forget to subscribe. Tomorrow's story is about a man who sat silently through his own engagement party while secretly knowing the groom was hiding a second family.